Hello everyone, it's a busy time here on Derek Hook's Lacan YouTube channel. Big announcement, we've now been running the channel for over 5 years. We've given a lot of content, a lot of interviews, lots of fascinating mini lectures. And just to say what's happened now with YouTube is YouTube has offered us the possibility of a channel membership platform. So we'll be taking this up in the coming weeks. We've got a number of series of mini lectures coming up, one of which is rereading Lacan's Mirror Stage, but we'll also be delving into some of Lacan's later work, picking up on topics like the symptom. The aim will be both to do further explorations of clinical topics and social theory topics, but to develop each of these, hopefully in a new studio setting. But with the channel membership platform, please do sign up for that. Members will get exclusive content that won't be available elsewhere. We'll also be holding Q&A sessions at the end, live stream Q&A sessions at the end of each of these newly dropped series of mini lectures. And this will also give me the opportunity to build this community a little bit more that we've been working on all these years. Unfortunately, I haven't always been able to answer all questions online, but with the live stream Q&A sessions, that'll be precisely the way to do this in real time. Last point to make about all of this is that this will also be a great opportunity for members of the community to suggest topics that we can think of and consider for future mini lectures in this series. So thanks so much for all your support. Please do sign up. Going to look at some of the underemphasized themes within Lacan's Mirror Stage, famous Mirror Stage paper. We're going to do that with two additional resources. One will make reference to Calum Neill's commentary on the Mirror Stage as formation of the I function. And we'll also make reference to Dany Nobus's commentary on the Mirror Stage, both of which are highly recommended. Dany Nobus's chapter is included in the book he edited called Key Concepts of Lacanian Psychoanalysis, and he gives the title of the chapter Life and Death in the Glass, a new look at the Mirror Stage. Now, many of us will have had a lot of introductory discussions and explorations of the Mirror Stage, and that's all good. But I think what we often find is that despite the assumption that now we've got it, now we know what the Mirror Stage is about, it's often the case that there's a bunch of themes or concepts that maybe slightly have eluded us. And so what we want to do today is list a couple of those themes. Not going to be completely exhaustive, but we want to make a note of some of the possible themes that may have missed our focus or attention in how we go about understanding the Mirror Stage. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to go to 75 of Bruce Fink's translation of the full version of Acree. And I'm going to give us a sentence, and then we'll identify a theme and move on in that way. So this is towards the bottom, page 75. We've had the introductory sentence. Lacan has pointed out he's at odds with any philosophy directly stemming from the cogito, which of course is kind of a bold statement. But what I want to draw attention to is maybe a slightly more modest point. He says, he's talking about the aha erlebnis. In other words, this eureka moment that we so often reiterate when we think about the Mirror Stage, that's me moment. And he says this act, far from exhausting itself, as in the case of a monkey, in eventually acquired control over this uselessness of the image, immediately gives rise in the child to a series of gestures in which he playfully expresses the relationship between the movements made in the image and the reflected environment, and between this virtual complex and the reality it duplicates, namely the child's own body. So a couple of things just to reiterate there. One, there's something that's very important about movement and also the reduplication of movement. But the question I really want to note and posit for us, when we think about the Mirror Stage, we tend to, I think, focus on the image in the mirror that gives a kind of cohesion and sense of resolution and outline and substantiality to a bodily portrayal of the ego. But do we pay enough attention to the environment, the space around what else is included in that environment. So here's the quote again, talking about the aha erlebnis, the eureka moment. This gives rise in a child to a series of gestures, okay? There's gestures in which they playfully experience the relationship between the movements made in the image. So they're moving, they see movement in the image, and the reflected environment. So just to note that as one of our first themes, do we spend enough time thinking about the spatiality, the spatial environment of the image? The relationship between the movements made in the image and the reflected environment. So it's not just an image of bodily image that's reflected, it's the spatial dimension as well. Between this virtual complex and the reality it duplicates. And I just want to keep that in place. Virtual complex. So the virtual complex, a first reading of that would be, well, maybe the virtual complex is the body that is now given some cohesion, but the virtual complex could be the body in its motion, in its activities within an environment, and the reality it duplicates. The reality it duplicates, presumably, of the experiential real of the subject who is doing the recognizing. He also says the reflected environment and the persons and things around him. Persons and things around him. Again, do we pay enough attention to the environment, but also the objects, the things, the persons that populate the backdrop to the image? We're immediately going to look at, take a quote from Calum Neill's helpful commentary on the mirror stage. He says, talking about the eureka moment, this is on page 137 of his commentary, this moment can be understood as the beginning of the child's ability to situate itself in the context of the world. So once again, the mirror stage is going to afford us not merely a kind of ideal ego image, which will have a kind of substantializing, coherence, giving sense of identity, but it also situates oneself in the context of the world. Back to Neill, this is an extremely complex operation. Even in adulthood, we simultaneously perceive the world and experience ourselves. To achieve this recognition, we need to perform a complex and imaginative operation of synthesizing these two experiences. That is to say, we have to imagine ourselves in the world. We have to imagine ourselves in the world. Okay, so what we're saying is, and he goes on to say it, Neill says it on page 138, there is a spatial significance to what is being spoken about. Okay, I'll just read one further quote and then we'll move on. He says on 138, this is Neill, the child is captivated by the reflection of its movements and the apparent relationship between these movements and the reflected movements and their reflected backdrop. The reflection of the backdrop, the environment in which and against which the child's reflected movements appear, is important to keep in mind. The two worlds, the mirror world and reality, appear connected. Added to this, it's not only going to be the room, the furniture, the toys and so on which are reflected in the mirror, but crucially there will be other people too. What's another way of putting that? It's to say, I think, that there's a kind of an assemblage of what the ego is, an assemblage of the ego which is potentially including environmental pieces and objects and other people within it as well. Now that makes sense because, bear in mind, what's crucial, one of the crucial concepts in the very early Lacan and in this essay is the notion of transitivism. Transitivism, the way I understand it, is a kind of overextension of the ego or an over-inclusiveness of the ego, such that when the child next to me complains of being hungry, then I suddenly feel hungry too. The child next to me has a trip and falls and hurts themselves and cries, I feel that too. So this overextension of the ego, I know it's a basic point for Lacanians, but let's just try to bear in mind that the ego is never thus cut apart. Certainly if the mirror stage seems to be functioning in some ways, cut apart from any environment, from any situation, from any world of objects of which it is a part. So that's the first theme I wanted to note, this kind of amalgamation of ego with its objects, with its spatial coordinates, with bits and pieces of things and place and environment around it. That's theme number one. Theme number two comes when we turn the page and we're on to page 76 of Lacan's mirror stage. And he says, he's talking about the jubilant activity when the little infant is propped up so that they can see this image. He says, in my view, this activity has a specific meaning up to the age of 18 months, and it reveals both a libidinal dynamism that has hitherto remained problematic and an ontological structure of the human world that fits in with my reflections on paranoic knowledge. There's theme number 2. What the hell does he mean by paranoic knowledge? For me, this is one of those terms, I'm making a note, paranoic knowledge, that we kind of routinely name check, but do we get actually what Lacan means by paranoic knowledge? So libidinal dynamism, I think we can state that, there's both a loving, a narcissistic attraction, a narcissistic love for what the image enables us to do, and therefore what we think of as ourselves, an ideal image that gives us a cohesion which we love and gives us a kind of narcissistic vroom vroom. But there's also the possibility of a very fundamental aggression towards an image that does not afford us the properties of being held together, of being given some cohesion and coherence. So that we've got. But what does he mean by this notion of paranoic knowledge? We've already suggested then that there's a kind of amalgamation of ego in its environment with objects and things around them and other people. And we've suggested that there's something happening with the notion of transitivism. So paranoic knowledge is going to need some of those concepts for it to work. Why is paranoic knowledge so important that he even emphasizes that it fits with a notion of ontological structure of the human world? And why does this paranoid knowledge, let's say a paranoid relationship to what knowledge can do, or that knowledge itself is paranoid at some level, why does that fit with transitivism in this dimension of the world? Okay, so we're going to leave that as a hanging question. What we're going to now move to is one of the quotes that Dany Nobus gives us in his commentary, and this will prove, I think, very helpful as we move forward. It'll also give us a further theme, maybe our third theme, for the underemphasized themes in thinking about the mirror stage. He wants to note the role of desire. And let me just note something here. You could say that in a very naive way, sometimes there's this idea, well, desire is metonymic. Desire develops when we think about the symbolic. What does the other want? And desire being metonymical needs language to function. So you could say, well, maybe I think about desire kind of post the mirror stage. But this would be an error. This would be an error, and there's a very interesting articulation with this crucial Lacanian concept of desire as happening already when we think about the mirror stage. And again, not only is transitivism going to be important when you think about paranoic knowledge and this ego as an amalgamation of things around it as well as its body, but we'll also see how this concept of desire becomes important in this array of concepts that Lacan is working with. So on page 111, Dany Nobus gives us this nice qualification. He says, animal desires. I mean, I suppose we could even ask, do animals have desire? But let's play the quote out, read it out, and then move on. Animal desires converge on being and things, whereas human desires move beyond these given objects to act upon a non-being, which is nothing else than another desire. This is a non-biological human desire for another desire. So that may sound a little bit complicated at the moment, and what Nobus really does do a great job of is linking so many of these Lacanian concepts within the mirror stage to Hegelian concepts, and not just Hegelian concepts, but to Kojève's understanding of those. So just to reiterate that point right there and then, when we're starting to get close to something like the question of desire in the mirror stage, it helps to bear in mind, and of course this is also anticipating later movements and ideas in Lacan, that the desire is not simply for objects. It can be, and certainly is that as well, but it is always the properly human dimension of desire is that it is a human desire for another desire. Now, I like that. It's important to bear that in mind. But then one question I had was, well, okay, that sounds all very great. That sounds Hegelian. But desire is another desire. How does that link us back to Freud? And Neill gives us a nice remark there. And he says something which in retrospect kind of makes sense. And why didn't I think of that first? But it's helpful that he says that. So he's saying that, okay, In Kojève's famous reading of the master-slave dialectic, an encounter is understood in terms of each player's desire to be desired by another. Okay? Connects us to the Nobus idea. In the world of psychoanalysis, the key example of this would be the Oedipus complex, where the child largely relates to the desire of the mother. This should be understood in a number of ways. Not only does the child desire to be the object of the mother's desire, it also comes to model its desire on the fact of the mother's desire. Beyond this, the child has to face the fact that it is never adequate to the mother's desire. She always desires something more, something else, something elsewhere, something other. So we have a nice connection point here to note that desire is crucially apparent within some facet of the mirror stage paper, but also the qualification that we need to decide and think that desire, not decide, understand that desire in relationship to Hegelian, Kojèvian understandings of desire for another. And we can now also see how that links to questions of Oedipal desire. So let us stay with this Hegelian theme, Kojèvian theme, and note something that Nobus does, pointing out perhaps understated, although perhaps not, theme, and that is the question of how desire relates to speech. So we'll turn to Nobus. He gives us this point on page 112. Kojève, he says, emphasized the crucial component of speech, logos, which enables a human being to reveal being and which enables them to express desire for desire. Without speech, a creature can never attain self-consciousness. Speech constitutes the necessary condition for a human being to transcend consciousness and self-sentiment, and to develop self-consciousness. As Kojève puts it, desire is always revealed as my desire, and to reveal desire, one must use the word, in other words, speech. This implies that the animal attains only sentiment of self, I suppose you could say consciousness, but not fundamentally self-consciousness. That is, it cannot speak of itself. It cannot say I. So maybe we can make that a whole lot more straightforward, but just to say that we often are confronted in the Lacanian world with the notion of desire. We're often confronted with the fact that speech is significant, and we're often confronted with this idea that desire links me to others. But now we have a kind of crucial, as it were, joining factor, the fact that without speech, a type of self-consciousness is not attained, according to Kojève, and this, in other words, means that speech is both crucial to psychoanalysis and also that it is a kind of activator of desire. Back to the last part of that quote, one cannot attain a degree of self-consciousness. One cannot attain a certain relationship to desire without an I. Nobus builds on this point, and I think it's kind of useful because he's going to say, what is it that we do with speech? Again, it might seem obvious, but it links back to some crucial philosophical coordinates, and it has an important implication in terms of clinical practice. So we're staying on page 112 with Nobus's chapter. He says, speech allows the human being to reveal him or herself as self. But this being that's revealed through speech, okay, reveals being through speech. I can express, I can speak about, I can confer a kind of form of identity. I can refer back to myself. I put myself into words. I put myself into speech. This being revealed through speech is always twofold, since it compromises a revealed being as well as a revealing being. In other words, when presenting oneself in speech, a human being is both subject and object. And we could say subject and object simultaneously. Back to the direct quote from Nobus. He or she is an agency, the revealing being, that reflects upon and objectifies themselves, the revealed being. They are, okay, that's the end of quote, page 112. I'm going to just emphasize that again. One, in speaking, is an agent or an agency because I'm revealing, I'm speaking, I'm expressing, I'm doing something, but that reflects upon and objectifies itself. In other words, in doing that speaking, I'm also referring back to me. Now, that, you could say, is really fundamentally important. Not only does it link to a whole series of important ideas within structural linguistics, but it also does a very Lacanian thing, which points to the necessary gap or the minimal or disjunction that the very subject instantiates in beginning to speak. Because those two things, maybe they're simultaneously happening, being both subject and object, being both the agency and that which is objectified, maybe they seem to fit nicely together, but those two things never fully combine. This is one way of approaching the structural quality of the split subject. What I also found useful about how Nobus reiterates this, again playing off Cogevian Hegelian ideas, is that it sheds some light on the distinction we often hear in Lacan, that being the distinction between the subject of the statement and the subject of speaking, or the subject of enunciation. The subject of the statement and the speaking subject of enunciation. Once again, that speech, in a way, splits me every time I utilize it to both be the agent of speech and the one who's being referred back to. And I suppose you could say that the very fact that we do not experience that split or that distinction or that non-reconcilability, to use a kind of Lacanian way of approaching it, the fact that we don't seems to suggest that we have a strong egoic imaginary function which holds us together and gives us an imaginary sense of coherence. Despite that, you could say we're reenacting a split of the subject every time we speak and speak about ourselves. I'll give us one last point and then we'll stop for this first installment of this series of lectures on understated themes within the mirror stage. Here is a kind of important further theme for us. There are a number of times when Lacan talks about the distinction, a minimal distinction between a specular I and a social I. So what's going on with that? So I found, again, Nobus's discussion of this point very helpful. So here it is. For Lacan, says Nobus, self-consciousness can be equated with the expression of a desire for recognition. Let's just hold that in place. Self-consciousness. And remember, we've just done a whole lot of work on how one even attains self-consciousness via speech. One attains self-consciousness via speech, which also splits the subject, which suggests that instead of this kind of optical illusion of focusing, as we might say certain forms of existentialism and phenomenology do, on the what self-consciousness makes available, the psychoanalytic take here would be to say, well, self-consciousness makes certain things available, but at the same time, it produces a kind of, or it relies on the speech that reinstantiates the split of the subject. Okay, but let's re-emphasize now again, Lacan equals self-consciousness with the expression of a desire for recognition. Equals self-consciousness with the expression of a desire for recognition. Recognition, we're hearing the Hegelian stuff, and we're hearing a Hegelian stuff, a desire for recognition, which always appeals to and entails and relies upon others. Back to the Nobus quote. Whereas this aspect of mirror recognition was not broached by Kojève, Lacan regarded it as the ontological mold for the social struggle for prestige. Through its identification with the mirror image, the child positions itself as both similar to and different from other human beings, from which the aggressive struggle for prestige can follow. In Lacan's own words, the end of the mirror stage, that is to say, the child's assumption of its mirror image, entails the deflection of the specular into the social I, and this decisively tips the whole of human knowledge into mediatization through the desire of the other. So let's just pull a couple of points out of that. Self-consciousness for Lacan and a desire for recognition, these two things go together. Through its identification with the mirror stage, the child is both being able to position itself as similar to and yet different from other human beings. And this desire for recognition is involved in a social struggle for prestige. So one very basic take-home point from this is that to have an ego means to be one enmeshed in a kind of assemblage of others and an environment, to be both trying to separate oneself from that, but still to be fundamentally alienated by virtue of one's reliance on those things to even have this image. So we got that tension, but within that tension, there's also a kind of aggressivity, a desire for recognition. And a desire for recognition, which means that there's always going to be, as Dany Nobus puts it, a social struggle for prestige. And so there is this sense in which there's an aggressive struggle that always comes with even having a mirror stage, with even having a kind of ego. But it's also interesting to suggest that there's a sense in which the end of the mirror stage tips the child even more fundamentally into the social I. To go back to the quote, decisively tips the whole of human knowledge into the mediatization through the desire of the other. Mediatization seems a bit of a complicated word there. Maybe it means that you are fundamentally condemned to being able to or needing to always struggle against and make sense of yourself within this field of desiring others. And of course, that is something which entails a need for recognition, a struggle against others, a hope to have some narcissistic recognition of being somehow special, whilst also never being able to fully separate oneself from exactly that group of others whom have afforded one an identity, an ego. It helps just to add one further part of the extended quote from Nobus, just to try and wrap up that series of ideas. With his mirror stage, says Nobus, Lacan clarified how a human being comes to distinguish the desire of the other in the first place. Yet by relating the mirror stage to Hegelian dialectics, Lacan also emphasized the conflictual nature of this experience itself. Indeed, apart from a me, the mirror stage also installs a rival other, on whom one can never steal a march and whose good looks are often discordant with one's own feelings of discomfort. Aggressivity is thus as much an intrapsychic as it is an interpersonal incident. Aggressivity in this account is inescapable. It is a structurally inherent element of having an ego. So let's stop there. We've got three crucial ideas. One is the role of desire. The other is paranoid knowledge, which we didn't describe much, but we will do shortly. And the third one, or I suppose the first one that we broached, was this idea of the spatial dimension. We'll stop there and follow up in a little bit.